Welcome. In this demonstration, we will look at how to draw a mountain with more details. So essentially, in another demonstration, I showed how you can simply, have a mountain defined by just using these parallel lines and then adding a bit more kind of, lines to give it some kind of tone. So this is one approach we saw in another demonstration. But what we will do in this demonstration is to actually draw mountains that have more planes. So essentially, a mountain becomes more interesting, when you can actually see the distinct planes, that define different edges and things like that. And that's what we will see, how we can do in this demonstration. So let's again start by laying down our different planes. So essentially, if you have a mountain, you can either have a flat horizon line and then you can have a mountain against it, or you can define these different planes that we have seen, like something like this, right? And then have mountains across it. So that's what I think this setup is more interesting, and that's what we will do in this demonstration. So let's start by drawing the plane that is closest to us. So, as I explained before, you always start by drawing the plane that is closest to us, and then you draw other planes that kind of, are hidden behind it. So that's the plane that is closest to us, and I always draw it in a dotted line, because if you want some other element that will go over it, then you can easily draw that. And then let me again have a second plane that goes something like this. And then what I will do finally is to add this plane in distance. So this will be the most distant plane, something like this. And this is where we will draw our mountains over here. So to draw a mountain that has more planes, essentially what you need to do is to give a jaggedness to its edges by doing something like this, like a staircase kind of thing. So this is the kind of edge you use, and then what you do is essentially, when you have a line like this defines a change of plane. So if you have a line that changes direction, that defines a change of plane. And then what you can do is simply have another line come down that makes that plane much more explicit. To again give you an example, let's say we have this kind of staircase, something like this. And then what you do is you take a line down like this and something other line down like this, and there you have a plane that is perpendicular. And this is a horizontal plane. And this is perpendicular plane. So what we are now doing is essentially, adding these different kinds of planes to our mountain, and that, makes it much more interesting. So that's what we will do. So something like this. So again, I will show you the detailed steps in my demonstration, but what we do essentially, is we start by drawing our mountain, and what we will do this time is we won't have, a mountain like this, where the edges are smooth, but we will have a bit of more jagged shapes like this to our mountain. So I'll start by essentially, doing something like this. A jaggedness to our mountain, and on the other side I will do something similar. So that's how you're defining your mountain as having these jagged edges. And then what we will do in the next step is to bring out these different jagged planes to give it more definition. And I will start and do something similar over here as well, and I will have another mountain something like this. And then finally I will just have a third small mountain going further out of the distance, so something like this. So essentially, in the first step, what I did is to simply kind of have these jagged edges kind of define the mountains. And what we do next is to essentially use these change of these lines where they change direction, and we start to define their vertical plane. So this line that goes up straight, that defines a vertical plane. So that's what I do then. Then I bring out this line, and this defines a kind of vertical plane for us. And what I do is to draw a line that meets at a point. So this defines a plane for us for this mountain, a vertical plane. And I'll do something similar for other parallel these vertical lines as well. So essentially now I'm defining edges like this, and then I'm using different shapes. So here I can have a small plane something like this, and over here I can have something similar like this. So that's what I'm doing essentially. By having these jagged edges, I bring down this line, and so this kind of line that is vertical is defining a vertical plane, and then I just bring down these two lines from the top and the bottom and meet them in a point, and that defines a kind of vertical plane on the mountain. And what happens is that once you have this vertical plane, then the line that is horizontal, this defines a horizontal plane. So essentially, for example, here, I can bring down this vertical plane something like this over here. And then you can see that this is kind of a horizontal or something like that plane over there. This way you're having a vertical and horizontal plane. So this is the vertical plane, and this will be your horizontal plane, something like this. So essentially, by this way you are able to kind of have a series of vertical and horizontal planes to give your mountain a bit more definition. And I will do the same over here. So this here, something like this. So again, just by adding these two lines from the top and the bottom of this vertical line, and meeting them somewhere here, I have a plane, a vertical plane that defines a kind of edge of that mountain. And then I will do something similar for this other vertical lines as well. So there you have it. So depending on how you define the edges. So for example, in this case, so this will be a big vertical line. For example, big vertical plane, something like this. Something like this. So again, you can use different shape of the edges to essentially define how the different vertical planes will be in your mountain. So essentially in this approach, what you're doing is you're actually defining a bit more definition to your mountain by having these explicit vertical planes, something like this, right? And I will go ahead and darken these lines just to give it more interest. And again, so if you see there's a vertical line and there's a horizontal line, so at the intersection point I bring down this line, something like this, and at the base of the vertical line I bring down the second line, meet them at a point, and this defines our vertical plane that I then shade using the parallel line. So essentially we are kind of highlighting the vertical planes and making it a bit darker. So again, the notion is that when the sun is falling, then these horizontal planes, they will be lighter because they receive more sun, and these vertical planes, because they receive less light, they will be darker. So that kind of establishes a nice contrast of the lighter horizontal planes and the darker vertical planes, and that gives our mountain a bit more definition, something like this. So now you can see that our mountain is now acquiring much more kind of so essentially this series of vertical and horizontal planes essentially gives a nice definition to the mountain compared to this approach where you essentially are just kind of indicating some kind of texture in the body of the mountain, but at the edges essentially that kind of planes are not visible. And again, I'll do the same approach for this one over here. So again, you can see that this is a bit of vertical line. So I drop a line from the top and then drop a line from the bottom of this vertical line. And there we have a kind of, vertical plane. So again, the angle of this line will determine the angle of this plane. So for example, if you have something like this, and this is a very vertical plane that you will have. On the other hand, if you have something like this, then this plane will be kind of, a bit angular plane, something like this. So that's what, when you're drawing the outline of your mountain, you're essentially defining the kind of, planes that the mountain will have on its edges. So there, and then again, I do something similar for this mountain as well. So essentially, just locate the vertical lines in your outline and then draw a line from the top, the line from the bottom of the vertical line, make them meet at a point, and that is your vertical plane in the mountain. And again, use different shapes for this vertical plane. So what I will do, for example, here is have this a long thin vertical plane, for example, something like this. So this will be a long thin vertical plane that we have in this mountain. For this vertical line, I will have a short kind of vertical plane, something like this. So essentially, by adding these kind of different vertical planes, you can have a nice variation in your mountain and add it more interest. Over here I'll just have a small vertical plane as well, but it's important to meet them at a point. So once they meet them at a point is when you have this kind of slice, and then this horizontal line or the close to the horizontal becomes a horizontal plane. So that is how you create these different planes in your mountains. So there we have it. And what I can do, for example, again, I have a bit of vertical line. Again, I bring down a line like this, and second line, meet them at a point, and this as is a vertical slice we have on that mountain. So there we have it. So this is how you essentially create different planes. And here again you can see that there's a kind of slightly slightly angled line. So I can either choose to leave it as is and just draw a line, something like this, to make it a kind of horizontal plane, or if I wanted, I could have actually drawn a bit more highlighted plane. So this is the approach that you use to essentially draw these different vertical and kind of horizontal planes. So essentially, what we're doing is defining our mountain as consisting of a series of vertical and kind of horizontal planes, and that is giving a definition to our mountain, and that is giving a more sense of feature for the mountains. Essentially, by bringing out these explicit planes, vertical and horizontal, now our mountains are acquiring a bit more interest. And I will do something similar over here as well. So I'll just again bring down these two lines and make this a vertical. So again, you can see that this line was not vertical, a bit angled. So our plane also looks a bit angled, right? Over here, this line is also a bit angled. So what I will do something so this plane will also be a bit angled. And when you're doing the shading, always draw the shade, do this parallel line shading in the direction of the edge line. So again, if you have something like this is vertical, so your shading will be something like vertical to give it a very vertical feel. On the other hand, if you have something like this, and this is your plane, for example, then you will do the shading like this to give the plane a bit of slant. And I will go ahead and do something similar for this mountain. So again, what I'm doing, essentially locating the lines that are vertical or close to vertical, and then dropping the line from the top and the bottom of that line to essentially define these kind of planes for my mountain. And there we have it. And what you do next is to essentially, create some kind of, again, a bit of texture in these bodies, or areas. And the way you do it is to essentially draw a line like this, and then draw these parallel lines that start and end at a point. Again, so for example, in this area, if I want to draw a kind of, a plane, I will draw a line like this. And once I've drawn a line, then what I can do is I can start with a very small line, increase it midway, and then reduce it in size again. So what this is doing is this is creating kind of, a cut on the surface of the mountain. So essentially these lines, they create a cut on the surface of the mountain. So again, to give you an example, so let's say I draw a line like this. So this line, this is just a line, but if I want to convert this line into a plane, what I need to do is to kind of, have a parallel line shading. But you cannot, if you have a line like this, you cannot shade like this where the lines are all the same length, because that is now how things are in perspective. So if you have a cut like this, you have to shade it so that you start at a point here and you end at a point here, and in between your lines will be bigger. So you start like this, and then you something like this. So this is how, if you have a cut on the surface of a mountain, this is how it will appear in perspective. So this is very, very important to notice and use. So essentially, when you draw a line like this to imply a kind of cut on the surface of the mountain, then you start with a point, have a very small stroke, and then increase it towards the center, and then decrease it again towards the edges. So this now indicates that, on the surface of the mountain, you had a cut, and this black indicates that, it is darker. So essentially what you're saying is this is the kind of, vertical plane on the surface of the mountain, and because the sun is not able to reach or reaches less, it is darker. So this is how you're able to easily create these kind of vertical planes on the surface of the mountain as well. So for example, here I again draw a line like this, start small, draw big, and then you again small. So this is how, you can easily introduce these kind of cuts on the surface of the mountain, but always remember to start and end at a point. So this is the kind of shape that you will have, for a plane. So this is how that cut or a plane appears in perspective. Do not make it, a flat, something like this. So this is now how it will appear in perspective. So they should always start and end at a point. And what I can do is I can, add a bit more of over here. So I can, start at a point, increase it, and then decrease it. So now this, this is a different orientation of the cut. So essentially by using these lines in different orientation, you can introduce different cuts. So when you have a like this, then and you add these vertical lines, and this is a cut like this. On the other hand, if I add a line like this, and then I add something like this, then it indicates a cut in a different direction. So this is how, easily you can just, once you have drawn the, edges of your mountain, then you can easily add these kind of cuts as well. And then lastly, what you can do is to simply add a bit of dots, something like this, just to add, kind of surface imperfections, simple dots and things like that. So that's what I will do. I will just go ahead and, so you can either use a parallel line just to define the plane. So for example, here, we can see that this is a kind of plane, but if you want to bring it out more explicitly, you can just go ahead and, add a bit of parallel lines as well. Or you can just simply, add a bit of dots and, something like this. So essentially, because we don't have enough space to create explicit edges like this, what I'm doing is just adding a bit of dots just to, indicate the roughness on the surface, something like this. So you can just add a bit of, dots and something like that to kind of indicate a bit of roughness on the surface. If you have more space, for example, again, we have a bit more space over here, then I can, again, add a line like this, and then start at a dot, and again, shade it like this. So now I've introduced, another cut in this part of the mountain, and this is the plane. And so this is how you can easily, introduce cuts in the body of the mountain. Essentially, so in this approach, your mountain will look like it has jagged edges, and then there are other further cuts on the surface, on its surface. So this is a different approach for the mountain compared to, this approach where you have a far out view. So essentially, you need to be aware, as to how much detail you want to show in your drawing for a particular element. So if your mountain is very far away and you just want to show less detail, then you cannot use this approach, because here, by implicitly by having these planes, the assumption is that, that the mountains are a bit closer, so that these kind of, different planes and these cuts are visible to the viewer. So you always have to keep that in mind as to what distance the mountains are at, and then use, those appropriate things to make sure that the level of detail corresponds with the distance that element is from the viewer. and again here a little bit here. So again, just add a bit here, a bit there, and there you have it. So this is how easily you can draw a mountain that has a bit more interest in it. So it has different planes that the viewers can see, and then they can see the jaggedness of the mountain a bit much more clearly compared to when you have just an outline and some kind of texturing to the surface that we saw in other tutorial. And once we are done, what I will do next is to also create some kind of base for this mountain. And we have seen that how we can use the parallel lines as a distant tree line. But what I will do over here is essentially use a series of pine trees. So in other tutorial we saw that to draw a pine tree at a distance, you simply draw a line and then you just add this small lines, something like this, in a tapered manner to draw a pine tree at a distance. So essentially these are very small dots like this almost like a dot or a very small line, and then you just add it over here, something like this, and then you can darken the base to indicate a bit bigger trunk, and there you have it. So this is how you can easily draw pine trees at a distance. So what I will do is essentially I will draw a series of pine trees at the base, and this is my plane where those pine trees will be. So what I do is I start by having a line, and then again simply add a bit of dot here, a bit of dot there, and soon we have a pine tree that is at the base of this mountain. There we have it. And then I will add another one, and again simply add a dot. So there we have it. So what will happen is that there will be this white spot at the top where they are kind of conical, right? So one tree is like this, the other tree is like this. So you'll have this white spot over here, and this will kind of serve to kind of give a nice illusion of a series of pine trees. So they will not merge with each other because there will be this kind of white spot right there that will serve to make those different trees stand out separately. So there we have one more. Then I can add a bit more here. So there you have it. So these pine trees, I like them because they provide a nice backdrop to a mountain, but you can also use your parallel lines for a distant tree line, or you can even treat a distant foliage. We have seen a lot of example of these different ways to have a backdrop in other tutorials, but it's always good to have a backdrop, and especially with the mountain. The transition of the mountain to the ground is always a bit tricky over here, and it's always good to have some kind of foliage or some kind of distant backdrop that helps us to kind of have a nice transition. The viewers can now see that there's a nice tree line below the mountain, which is usually the case. Below the mountains you will always have some kind of tree line. It's always good to add that. So now we are simply adding a series of pine trees over here, and there we have it. So you keep using the same approach and draw a line, and then just add dots or small needle strokes, something like this, in a taper, and then you will have an appearance of a distant pine tree. There we have it. And if you want now, you can also actually combine this pine trees with the kind of distant tree line as well, or some kind of other foliage feel. So over here what we can do is, again, now we can use a bit of parallel lines as well if you want at the bottom of the mountain. So you can always combine these different distant approaches for distant foliage. So here I used a bit of pine trees. Here I know I've used the typical parallel lines that we have seen for distant tree line. So essentially, to draw a distant tree line, just draw these parallel lines, something like this, and again draw it in an organic form, something like this. So you can see that my shape of the top of this line is kind of organic, that you will see in a typical distant trees. So there we have it. And then what I can do over here is to just have a kind of this. So you can always just use a bit of strokes like this to indicate some kind of foliage in the distance, something like this. So together these are different elements, and you want to avoid having too much of one thing. So if I just had pine trees all along, then I think it will be a bit boring compared to now when we have a bit of pine tree, a bit of distant tree line, and then there is some kind of other foliage that we have over here. So again, quickly you can just use something like a distant bush we are drawing. So we have seen how you can draw a bush using these loops, strokes like this. And what we are doing over here is to essentially just adding a bit of loop here, something like this, and creating a feel of distant bush or foliage at the bottom base of the mountain. So there we have it. So now we have a nice combination of a distant kind of bush kind of foliage, a set of pine trees, and our distant tree line. And what I will do finally is to essentially now define the plane. I mean, we can add a bit more trees over here as well and do something else, but I will not do it for this demonstration because my main purpose was to show you how you can actually draw the mountains, and that's what we have done. And what I will do simply is to just have some kind of ground cover for our other two planes. So So now I can finally darken. So this is our ground cover. So this is the closest mountain, the one behind it, and this is the furthest out. And now we can add a kind of ground cover using the grass or some other stroke. So now again, we have seen in a lot of other demonstrations, you simply use a stroke like this to essentially draw some kind of ground cover for these planes, and that's what we will do. But again, you have to use a smaller size stroke for the far away plane, and as you get closer to the viewer, this plane will have a bigger grass stroke. So again, I'll start by this furthest out plane and use a very small, almost like something like this grass stroke over here. And you can even use dots, just dots and some kind of grass stroke or something like this, small lines, something like this, or even dot, a combination of dots and something like this. But essentially what you're doing is essentially providing some kind of a bit of texture to the ground to indicate that, there is something, some kind of ground cover on the ground. So if you leave it white, that doesn't look as nice compared to when you have some feel of, a ground cover texture. And what you can also do is, just add a bit of dots at the base of these trees to ground them. So we have seen that, to ground them in a trunk, you need to have some kind of darkness at the base of it. So what I do is I simply use a few of dots here, a few dots there, and create a bit of darkness at the base of these pine trees. And as you can see, at the moment you add a bit of darkness to the base of these trees, these trunks, they appear grounded. So that's a very simple technique. And depending on, if you have proper, if your trunk is up close, then you can use a proper grass stroke, something like this. But if it is far out, something like over here, then you can use your dot, something like this. Do not use this kind of, stroke. So do not create a hard darkness. So this is a hard darkness. This hard darkness, doesn't gel well with the ground feel, because on the ground you essentially have, a different foliage, flowers, grass, what have you. And that, the feel of that comes if you use a, this kind of stroke, dots, simple loops. So these are kind of, foliage strokes that you can use. So this kind of strokes, you can use for your ground cover, but don't use a hard stroke like this, because that doesn't, gel well with the feeling of ground cover. So I just simply use a bit of dots, or you can even use a bit of line, something like this, even to draw a bit of ground texture. So I use a combination of those things, and there we have a kind of feel of ground covers. And you can see that just having a ground cover on any plane makes it more interesting. So that's what I did over here. And what I will do for the other planes is to actually then also define their ground form. So we have seen in other tutorials, you can use these kind of lines to essentially define the form of that plane. So now, and for the closest plane, I just use a line like this. So what essentially happens with these lines is now you have a bit more clear understanding of how the ground is oriented. And here I can add another series of lines. So essentially now these lines, they serve to actually define the ground form. So essentially now we understand, that the form of the ground. And then what you can do is to add a bit of, ground cover on this line as well. So we could have used these ground form lines for the distant plane as well, but because it was so small, I just used the foliage directly, the ground cover directly. So now I will go ahead and add a bit of, ground cover to this other plane as well. So again, what I'm doing is simply using the same grass stroke, something like this over here, and just quickly adding a bit of ground cover. And again, you could have added more elements to these other planes as well, but for my drawing, I'm just kind of focusing on the mountain and the distant foliage for this demonstration. And what I will do is again add a bit of grass to this closest plane. But what I will do is also, to make it more interesting, I will add a bit of tall grasses like this. So essentially, we have seen in the demonstration how you can use this stroke to add, grasses like we did over here. But what you can also do is to essentially add a bit of variety to the grass on your ground. So this is kind of a homogeneous kind of, grass distribution. So essentially I added, this kind of grass stroke almost uniformly across the plane, so it looks like kind of grass covered. But what you can also do is to kind of have some isolated spots where you have a bit thicker density of grass. So something like this over here, something like this over here, like this, right? So you can also add this kind of a bit of variation in the grass density, and you can also add this kind of lines to indicate a bit of tall grass. So essentially, you draw a wiggly line, then have a small this wiggle to ground this long grass, and then a bit of pod at the top. So something like this. This also indicates a nice, gives a nice feel for a kind of a tall grass or some kind of other foliage on the ground. So so you can use that effectively, and then you can have this kind of grass as well. So a different combination of these things, really gives more interest to the ground. And again, the landscape is all about having different elements that the viewers can look at, and then they can connect with, right? So for example, here I just use this tall grass to have a bit of more interest over here. And then what you can even do is, then at the edge of the tall grass you can have this short grass as well, right, to highlight them. So again, using this very small stroke, something like this, I can add over here as well, something like this over here. So again, so now it has more interest than just having kind of bare grass covered plain. So this is how you can add different elements. So again, a tall grass, or we can even add a flower like this. You draw a stem like this and then ground it. So you can even have a flower, something like this over here as well, something like this. So you can have a combination of flowers and tall grass and other foliage. You can even have a small bush over here, for example, and yeah, and then even a small grass in between to provide the ground cover. So now this ground, this plane, looks more interesting because we have different elements, of ground cover going on there. And then here, and if I want, I can have a bit of flowers over here as well. So when you're drawing flowers, you always draw them in a bit of patches. I mean, they look nice. So that's, because essentially, whenever somebody looks at a drawing, their eyes travel from one part of the drawing to the other. So essentially, they try to, go move around in your drawing. And if you have kind of, different patches of interest, for example, I have a wildflower over here, then the eyes will go from here and then they will move to different patch. So, essentially, our eyes, they don't take in the whole drawing at the same time as such. I mean, there's, what our mind does is it travels a different element. It focuses on this point is in the distance, and then it will move around and see this distant tree line, and then take in the mountain and come back to the fourth plane. So this is how the eyes are traveling, and there's a whole thing behind composition actually. So even before you start drawing, you have to think about how the different elements will be placed, and how they will make the eyes of the viewer move around the drawing. So I don't really address it. I just start with my composition that I have decided previously, and you can just follow along. But that's a very important topic in itself. And what you can do is just essentially add these different elements in different places to essentially provide different points of interest that the viewers can look at. So essentially, I have a bit of grass cover over here, a bit of grass cover over here, and then I can add something else over here, something like this. So having these different patches of interest, they make your drawings something that the viewers will stay with. Essentially, they will not just look at one thing and then they will see a kind of bland patch of grass and move away. So essentially, these different things will keep the viewer interested. So essentially, you can add a bit of wildflowers over here, a bit of grass, something like this, and then just finish it off by having this small grass as the ground cover. So that is a kind of a small grass that you can use to kind of provide a basic ground cover to the plane. So there we have it. And then I'm using a bit of bigger stroke over here. So essentially, this is something that you will play with, and you will learn, and and have your own approach with time. But essentially, so now this ground looks much more interesting, because we have tall grasses, a bit of wildflowers, or patches of wildflowers, and things like that, right? And you can even add a bit of dark, just to indicate some kind of other plant, for example, here. So this is how just by adding a bit of dark here, a bit of flower patch here, you're creating more interest on this for this plane. So essentially, we don't really have any element, as there's no tree or anything else, but you can actually make even the ground cover just the attraction of your drawing. So that's what I did, is that we have the distant mountains, but at the same time I always also try to make this this foreground for the plane that is closest to the viewer more interesting by having a bit more interesting ground cover. And this is something similar we could have done for this plane as well, right? So but I just wanted to show you for one plane how you can add different things like wildflowers, tall grasses, and you can just even add a bit of any kind of darkness. So like I said, these strokes, they all suggest some kind of ground cover, right? So what you need to do is to just practice to kind of be able to add them in a not random, but in a kind of organic manner to get this kind of feel for a nice ground cover, and that really adds interest to the drawing. And then I will also go ahead and darken just the plane line a bit, so that it is clearly stands out, and darken this line as well. And there we have it, a nice drawing we did in under 30 minutes, where we drew a distant mountain. And here, what, again, just to recap, what you do is you start by essentially defining this kind of edges for your mountain: the vertical, horizontal, not exactly like a staircase, but something like this. And then what you do is, from the lines that are almost vertical, you bring down the top. From the top, you bring down a line. From the bottom, you bring down a line. Meet them at a point, and this defines your vertical plane, a slice of the mountain edge, something like this. And this is what we did for different places. And essentially, we defined these vertical planes, and then the remaining horizontal line. So essentially, when you have this one vertical plane, and if you define another vertical plane, something like this, then what happens is that this plane, by default becomes a horizontal plane, something like this. And then your mountain becomes a series of such kind of, cuts at the edges, a series of vertical and horizontal planes. But again, by keeping it random like we did over here, and using different lengths of these vertical planes, short vertical plane, a bit longer vertical plane, you can add a nice interest to your mountain. So that's what we drew. And over here, again, let me just add. So here, there's a bit more white. So what I can do is, again, just simply add a bit of, and if you want, what you do also, you draw a line like this, and then start by a point, add a line longer in the middle, and then again decrease it towards the edge. So this is the kind of approach that you use to kind of introduce a cut on the surface of that mountain. So by using these different cuts, you're able to add more interest. And at other places where you don't have enough space, just kind of add a bit of these dots or some kind of something like this, or what have you, right? Just to kind of indicate some kind of roughness to the surface. And there you have it. You can have a nice mountain with much more definition than this other approach we saw, where I just textured the surface using a bit of parallel lines. So again, both these are different approaches. So here, essentially, we have much more definition of the mountain, and it appears a bit closer because you can actually see the planes. Whereas if you draw something like this, this is the approach that you use for drawing a far out mountain, where the edges are kind of smooth, and you just have some understanding of the surface feel for that mountain, right? So these are different approaches. Here I wanted to show you how you can actually draw a mountain with much more detail, and this is what we did. Thanks. Take care. Bye bye.